After years and years of anticipation, CD Projekt Red has finally released their newest massive open-world RPG experience,
Cyberpunk.
Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot of discussion surrounding this game over the past few weeks, as upon its release, Cyberpunk has quickly gone from being one of the most anticipated titles in recent memory to one of the most controversial due to the current state the game is in on the base versions of the PS4 and Xbox One. Simply put, the game is an absolute mess on those consoles, with unbearably low frame rates and constant pop-in textures. I luckily played the game on the PS5, and while the upgrades that will further take advantage of the next-gen hardware won't be available until sometime in 2021, the game runs far better than it does on the previous generation. I will note that the performance issues with the PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game will not affect my final score in this review, but I wanted to let it be known that the current state of the game on the previous generation is, in my opinion, unacceptable. Cyberpunk 2077 is set in a futuristic dystopian metropolis known as Night City, where people modify their bodies with technology, and the streets are filled with criminals and outlaws out to make a name for themselves. You play the role of V, whose gender and look is decided by the player, a gun-for-hire who is one of these aforementioned people looking for a name in this futuristic world. After a heist spirals out of control, you end up with an implant in your head containing the soul of a half-century dead punk rocker/terrorist known as Johnny Silverhand. Over the course of the game, the two of you take on a corporation and look for a way to resolve your issue. For me, Cyberpunk was one of the most entertaining and original stories I've experienced in a game in recent memory. The game does a great job at introducing you to its massive open world and set of characters who are all memorable and well written, with tons of depth and motivations. The game's main campaign was definitely shorter than one may come to expect, only taking me roughly 20 hours to complete, but the experience offered a lot. One of the best aspects of the story for me was the pacing. At times, the game feels like a slow burn, which in this case worked, as it allowed for a lot of conversations and relationships between characters to feel fleshed out, which resulted in me being invested in a lot of their storylines. One of my favorite of these relationships is the one between V, who the player controls, and Johnny Silverhand, who will show up whenever he wants and add his own personal views and opinions to certain situations, done in a very similar fashion to Joker in Batman Arkham Knight. Keanu Reeves is a lot of fun here in the role, and the character adds a great level of humor at just the right moments.
Know what? You're starting to remind me of me, 50 years back. Minus the charisma. An impressive cop.
At first, Johnny and the V of my playthrough would argue a lot and tend to disagree, with my character generally resenting him. But after spending more time with him throughout the main story, and having played a series of side missions that involves you reuniting him with a bunch of his old bandmates, and one mission in particular involving you locating his corpse, I really grew to care for him, and as a result changed the way I interacted with him in the story. The entire game isn't a slow burn, however, as there are obviously a ton of awesome set pieces to amp things up at the right moments. Some of these action-packed levels in particular really stood out to me for their design. While I loved the main story overall, with a game like this, the side missions are just as important to build a fully realized narrative. Some of my favorite side missions introduced me to characters like Panam, a hot-headed, gun-toting mercenary who is conflicted on abandoning her old clan of friends. Other side missions have you solving murder cases, where you'll have to use technology to recreate crime scenes and look for evidence, or even a series of races, which can help you unlock a new car. Side missions in Cyberpunk aren't just simple levels you complete and move on with, as the way you interact with the characters in them can completely alter relationships and the future of your game. For example, Panam became my character's love interest, which resulted in me unlocking different options for the endgame. But to get to that point, I had to be very careful with the dialogue and directions I took during her missions. Same can be said about Johnny and V's relationship, which was great to see build over the course of the game, and depending on the way it was tackled can open up alternative paths. There's a lot of different ways to tackle the game's story and side missions that will cause each player's V to be different from another. I definitely plan on replaying and making different decisions along the way just to see how drastic these differences can be. One minor issue I did have with the game's story and characters had to do with certain designs. There are some characters in the game who you'll interact with during flashbacks from Johnny's memories, set in a year like 2013 for example. In the main storyline, which is in 2077, you can meet up with these characters who are now well into their 80s, and I never once found the way that they looked, performed, or acted to be convincing of that. Some models could have easily passed for being in their 30s. I suppose there could be some serious de-aging agents in the future, but the game never mentioned this, so I just found certain elements unconvincing, especially when witnessing these characters in combat. Other than that one very minor and odd nitpick, I really don't have any issues with the story/side missions in the game, as I think it's brilliantly told with some excellent character writing and depth to make the fascinating world more engaging and worth exploring every corner of. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to the gameplay of Cyberpunk 2077, so I'll start with the basics of combat. In Cyberpunk, you can approach combat in a variety of ways, using tactics such as gunplay, stealth, melee, hacking, or a mixture of the bunch. Initially, I was not a fan of the gunplay in Cyberpunk. Control-wise, it feels fine, not as sluggish and bland as something like Fallout, but not quite as refined as something like Doom. My biggest issue initially was that enemies all felt incredibly bullet spongy, taking a ton of shots from my character without losing much health. Even landing headshots would take quite a while to kill enemies at first. I really like what CD Projekt Red did here from a stealth standpoint. I would often use my hacking skills, which you can do by holding down the left bumper to select objects to power them on and off, or to use them as a distraction to lure enemies away from each other. I would often hack security cameras to locate enemies, and then use any distractions at my disposal to allow me enough time to sneak up and take enemies out before hiding them in lockers, bins, or other forms of storage. Eventually, after putting in a decent amount of hours into the side missions, I began to discover far superior guns, some of them smart weapons that have tracking bullets, and one of my favorites being a laser sniper rifle known as the Widowmaker, that quickly became my go-to weapon. I've seen some people complain about the way melee feels in Cyberpunk, with many saying it feels rather floaty and impactless. I can definitely see where people are coming from, and I definitely wouldn't design my character around a melee build, but once I unlocked an extremely high damage katana, I found it pretty hard to not want to rush into crowds of enemies and slice them up into tiny pieces. As I mentioned earlier, hacking is something you can do a lot in combat, if you choose to. I mentioned how it worked for stealth as far as causing distractions, but if you make certain upgrades to your character, you can hack enemies and make them kill themselves, reboot their optics so they go blind for a few seconds, and many more options. All of this uses up RAM however, in-game RAM, not your own, so you'll have to be careful about what tactics you want to use, as there's a cooldown for these options. One aspect of the game that will definitely vary from player to player is how you choose to upgrade and modify your character. Like any open world RPG game, you have an upgrade tree, which you can use after gaining enough XP. You can choose to level up any of your main attribute levels such as strength, technical abilities, etc., and then use perk points to unlock new skills that are a part of the previously mentioned branches. As you play more and more of the game, you will automatically gain skill points. For example, if you get a lot of kills with a sword, the game will up your blade skills by 1, which will increase things like damage and speed. I didn't have any real specific path that I wanted to head in, so I ended up just upgrading whatever I felt like, but trust me, there are a ton of options for upgrades. Modification-wise, you can visit Ripper Docks at different locations on the map. To unlock modifications, you can use money earned in-game to buy new enhancements for your character. For example, I added the ability to double jump, which would allow me to reach higher areas much easier, and then I also bought Manta Blades, which would come out of my arm and can be used in combat. A lot of these upgrades can definitely unlock new potential for other combat paths, but you don't need to buy them if you don't want to. When it comes to traversal, Cyberpunk offers a wide selection of cars and motorbikes. At first, I wasn't a fan of how they felt. Some cars were too sluggish, while faster ones were especially hard to control, and I felt like I was constantly sliding all over the place. I actually preferred the feel of bikes, which to me were easier to control and a lot better for avoiding crashing into things. I eventually got used to the way they felt, but I definitely prefer driving in other open world games like GTA. One thing lacking from vehicles here was customization, which CD Projekt Red supposedly removed from the game. It's not a massive deal, but I always love to visually tailor vehicles in my games, especially changing paint colors, adding decals, and changing up wheels, so the lack of it here was definitely noticeable. As far as issues go with gameplay, there was something that became a bit of an annoyance in my playthrough. To crouch or stand back up, you use the O button on the PlayStation controller, which also happened to be the exact same button for skipping dialogue. So if I had accidentally pressed the crouch button before engaging in a conversation, I would have to wait the convo out before I could stand up again. This would be annoying if I were meant to follow a character, as when crouching, you move far slower. And there was definitely a good amount of times where I would accidentally skip dialogue because of this. A simple fix would be holding down O instead to skip dialogue. Another minor issue I had was reloading checkpoints. If I screwed up during a mission, I would often have to open up the settings, go to the saves, and load up one of my earlier autosaves. It's not a big issue, but it's a little tedious when most games just offer a simple reload checkpoint option right in the main settings list. If I had to drive to a location that was 4 kilometers away and I somehow died along the way, the game would spawn me all the way back at the starting point, requiring me to drive the full length again. Most of these aren't massive problems, but rather minor design flaws that I found to be a bit irritating at times. The biggest issues by far, however, come from the bugs and crashes. Throughout my experience, there was a lot of minor bugs, things like bodies flopping around, characters T-posing, objects floating, and many more. None of these are game-breaking, but they definitely got in the way of immersion at times. The more annoying glitches and bugs would be ones that would require me to reload checkpoints, or in one case, after completing a task, the game told me to leave an area, but when I tried exiting, it still thought I hadn't completed my objective, which meant I had to basically avoid the entire encounter, which was frustrating. Throughout my entire experience, the one thing that got in the way the most was the crashes. I have never experienced this many crashes in my life. At this point in time, I've easily received well over 20 crashes to the PlayStation menu, requiring me to reopen the game and at times restart levels. I even had one during the credits after finishing the game's story. It was a really annoying issue that got in the way of my enjoyment at times. Otherwise, gameplay was solid and I had a blast when the game actually worked. On the PS5, Cyberpunk 2077 has one visual mode that runs at around 1200p with a target 60 FPS frame rate, compared to the Xbox Series S version of the game, which offers both a visual and performance mode. Do note that the next-gen upgrades for the game do not come out until later next year, so the game uses the same unlocked settings as the PS4 Pro version of the game, but with a targeted 60 FPS instead of 30. The world of Cyberpunk is quite incredible. The map is expansive and filled with tons of locations that all have a very futuristic noir look and feel, very similar to the Blade Runner films. I'll talk more about locations later, but when it comes to graphics, the game definitely has issues. It is certainly far better looking than the base PS4, which unlocked quality can dip to the 600p range. But the game still has a rather blurry look to it. I found that turning off certain visual additions such as chromatic aberration and film grain did help, but certain elements still felt under-detailed, and shadows in particular looked pretty bad. That was not to say that everything was ugly graphically speaking. I found a good amount of detail in some small things, like my character's arm, which had defined veins, and good textures with noticeable pores on my skin. Draw distance in the game seems to be really low as well here. When driving, tons of objects will pop into existence at close range. It was pretty distracting, especially when you're walking, where you're taking in the game's scenery more. The city at times could also feel kind of lifeless with a lack of pedestrians walking around on sidewalks. Comparing it to footage shown a few years ago definitely tells you all you need to know. Frame rate wise, the game definitely seems to run pretty well. There were a few jitters here and there, but it always stayed above the 50 range, so it never got noticeable, whereas the game on PS4 dips to as low as 15 frames per second. Lastly, I'll talk about the HDR and colors. Cyberpunk suffers from similar issues as the new Resident Evil remakes, where black levels are pretty poor and come across as rather washed out and dark gray. The black levels are actually better when playing the game in SDR. There, they are far deeper. I tried messing around to get the HDR settings to where I wanted them, but it was either too bright or too washed out. Finally, let's talk about the map. While I do have my issues with the game's visuals, Cyberpunk undeniably features one of the most jaw-dropping open worlds in the game. If I have to be honest, it's probably the best I've ever explored, as I felt like there was such a variety in areas. The city itself was split up into many different locations. Some contained very small, close-together buildings, making it feel like slums. Then, more downtown, you can witness giant skyscrapers where flying vehicles soar above. Interiors of some of these large buildings were very grandiose, and the architecture felt plausibly realistic for the future. One of my favorite locations was Japantown at night, where the game had a lot of neon lights that really stood out, probably even more so with HDR, where the black levels would increase the contrast. Outside of the city was a desert area that was filled with cactuses and poor quality buildings. It reminded me a lot of a futuristic Los Angeles. To go along with all of this is the character designs, which all feels like they match their surrounding environments. It's clear that CDPR put a lot of work into developing the design of the city and its locations, as it feels thought out and it was a joy to explore. With a game like this, it's nice to take a break from missions and drive around for some sightseeing, which is sadly when the game tended to crash the most. I realize it probably sounds like I've been complaining for the majority of this review. The game does have a lot of performance issues with bugs and crashes, and visually it's a bit of a letdown on the next-gen consoles with its poor HDR, low shadows, and small draw distance. But everything else here is so well done. For the entirety of my experience, I found myself drawn into the story, its world, and characters. It's been a long time since I cared about the characters this much in an original story. Johnny Silverhand may easily go down as one of my favorite gaming characters of all time, and the rest of the cast shined. Developing friendships with people and a romantic relationship with characters like Panam was great to witness, mainly due to the game's incredible writing. CDPR definitely knows how to write characters well, giving them motivations and not rushing any of their storylines. I was always conflicted when making decisions, as I wanted to befriend new characters, but I didn't want to tarnish previous existing ones. Combat was extremely engaging, offering a wide variety of approaches. Gunplay was a bit stale at first, and enemies took next to no damage until I eventually acquired more powerful weapons, at which point it became a lot better, and firefights became a blast to play. And the world was filled with rich locations, featuring some of the best designs I've seen. The game is just sadly held back by its technical issues. In the future, when these problems have been ironed out and the game has received its next-gen upgrades, I will for sure be revisiting it, as the game has a lot to offer.
This is all very heartwarming, but you haven't paid me yet.
I know. Here.
May this blade serve you well.
Oh god, it's not gonna select a guy for me. Do not fucking select a guy for me. Oh, this is where you basically choose your sexuality, I bet. Yeah. James, is Angel the guy or the girl? Fuck. I think Angel was a guy, a girl. Okay, if it's a fucking guy, I'm gonna quit the game. No!